Good day, junior turkeys. Welcome to this video dealing with question 3 of the worksheet. My name is Mr. P. We're going to be looking at this very interesting question as it deals with some very important scientific investigative skills that you need to be aware of when you are studying for your final exam. Alright, so let's dive into the question that we're busy with now. So once again, this is question 3 of the worksheet. So if you don't have the worksheet on hand, try and get your hands on the worksheet memo, and also the theory booklet. Right, so let's have a look here at question 3. So the first thing with regards to question 3 is we need to get context. We need to make sure that we fully understand what this question is asking us and the parameters that we are dealing with within this investigation. So this is an investigation that was conducted by scientists, and we see here that this was to determine the effect of a low GI breakfast and a high GI breakfast on the average blood glucose concentration of women. Now, just in that statement, there's just so much information. If we have a look here, we know that it was conducted by scientists. The investigation dealt with both high and low glycemic index foods, particularly here breakfast. Okay, and what was being measured is the average blood glucose concentration, but here's an interesting parameter. We have the fact that this investigation was conducted on women. Okay, so men were not included in this investigation. So that's an important point for us to remember. If we look now at the next sentence here, we see that we have glycemic index being referred to, and it gives us sort of context. It gives us what glycemic index is. And when we look at glycemic index, it's a figure that represents the relative ability of carbohydrate food, so this is our sugar food, to increase the level of glucose in the blood. So something that is a high glycemic index has a very high ability to increase the level of glucose in the blood, and then vice versa. Our low GI foods have a relatively low ability to increase the level of glucose in the blood. All right, so that's important for us to take note of there. If we look at the steps that were followed in this investigation, we see that there were 10 women that were taken between the ages of 28 and 30, and they were volunteers to participate in this investigation. So we've got 10 women, and they were all between the ages of 28 and 30. So there are interesting parameters for this investigation as well. The next point, the blood glucose concentration of each female was measured before eating breakfast. Okay, so there we've got a baseline measurement for blood glucose concentration. Then the next point, after the breakfast, blood glucose concentration was measured again, but not only once, but every 15 minutes over a period of 120 minutes. So there are a couple of points for us to take note of in how this investigation was conducted, and also for us to take note of the fact that, if we look at this, we're actually given the aim in the first sentence. The variables have been identified for us throughout the whole of the context that we've been reading in this question. And if we have a look, we have the dependent, the independent, and the controlled variables of this investigation stated here. And for those that don't really remember what the controlled variables are, these are the variables that need to remain the same or constant throughout the investigation so that it does not skew the results of the investigation. Now, I'm not going to give away too much now. We're going to look at the graph first, and then we're going to be looking at some of the questions that were asked in this investigation. So here we can see the graph of these results. We see on our y-axis the average blood glucose levels after eating, and we can see the time, the period of time over which the results were collected. Now we can see the 15-minute intervals on the x-axis, and then we can see that there are two line graphs plotted, one for the high GI food and one for the low GI food. We can see that the gradient after the baseline measurement that was taken, the gradient of the high glycemic index food is much steeper than the gradient of the low glycemic index breakfast. So we can see there that the high GI food releases glucose into the blood a lot quicker than the low glycemic index food over there. And we can see the peak of each one after 45 minutes there. Right. Let's have a look at some of the questions now. So if we're looking at question 3.1, we need to identify firstly the independent variable, and this is what we are taking the measurements of. So we look at both high or low glycemic index foods. This is what I'm comparing. Now the tendency here would be to look at the x-axis and then identify time as my independent variable, but that's not what we're comparing here. We're comparing the high GI and the low GI breakfasts with one another. All right, the dependent variable is what I'm measuring, and over here what I'm measuring is the average blood glucose level or the average blood glucose concentration. We look at question C. Now we're looking at variables that ensure validity of the investigation. Now these are the variables that need to be kept constant throughout, and there are a couple of them that we can identify here. So one, as given to us in the text, because it refers to the variables that ensured the validity. So these are variables that the scientists have already standardized for us. So we need to go to the text and we need to identify these variables. And the first one we see is the sex, because they're all women. All right, that's the first one. Secondly, we're looking at the age, because the age parameter for this investigation of those women are between the ages of 28 to 30 years old. And lastly, we see that the measurements were all taken at 15-minute intervals for 120 minutes. So it asks us for 2. I've identified 3, and I'm going to select the best 2 of the variables that I was able to identify and put those down first as my answer, just to make sure that I get my 2 marks for question 3.1c. All right, let's have a look now quickly at question 3.2. Give the blood glucose concentration at 45 minutes after eating the high GI breakfast in millimole per liter. Now we go back to our graph and we, on the x-axis, identify the 45-minute mark, and we simply read off the average blood glucose concentration at the point for high GI breakfast. And we get 8.8 millimole per liter. If we move on to question 3.3, with reference to the graph, now we have to refer to the graph here. Describe the difference between the effect of eating low GI food compared to eating high GI food on blood glucose levels in women. So describe means we just need to refer to the what is going on rather than the why it is happening. So if I had to answer question 3.3, we're simply going to say that high glycemic index foods release energy faster into the blood because we can see that there is a much steeper gradient for the average glucose concentration for the high glycemic index food. So in other words, glucose is released faster into the blood. And you'll see there I've written at the end a reverse argument is also true. So if we refer to the low glycemic index foods, we would say that they release energy slowly into the blood when compared to high, and therefore there will be less glucose moving more slowly into the blood. There's our reverse argument for question 3.3. If we look at question 3.4 here, it says to us, name the hormone secreted by the pancreas that will cause the effects on blood glucose levels as seen in the graph from 45 minutes to 120 minutes. Now we'll see that after 45 minutes, which is where we find our peak, the blood glucose levels start to decrease. Now that would mean that the hormone secreted by the pancreas is actually taking that glucose, converting it to glycogen in the liver. And we know now, or we should know, that the hormone responsible for doing that is our insulin. Okay, that is the hormone that is responsible for taking glucose, converting it to glycogen, and storing it in the liver. If we look at question 3.5, it says, explain the effect of high GI breakfasts on the secretion of this hormone. And that would be the hormone in 3.4. So what would a high GI breakfast actually do to how this hormone is secreted? Well, if we look at it, high glycemic index breakfasts would cause more insulin to be secreted more quickly because there is a much larger glucose concentration in the blood more quickly as well. So that's how the increase in glucose concentration, or the rate of glucose concentration increase in the blood, would affect the production and secretion of insulin into the blood as well. Right, let's look at question 3.6. Question 3.6, 6 months later, the scientists decided to repeat this investigation. So they would have changed a few things. All right, and 5 additional women joined the investigation, of which some were not given breakfast at all, as a control group. Now, why the scientists decided to increase or add the extra 5 individuals? This would be to increase the sample size, which adds to the reliability of the investigation. And the purpose of the control would be that it would validate the experiment, because now we have something to compare both low and high GI foods to. So something to compare to as a norm, so normal, without an increase in glycemic index, without an increase in blood glucose at all. So this would be what happens with a control. It validates the experiment. Right, Junior Techies, well, I hope this investigation has helped us better understand investigations generally, how to approach these specific questions. My one big suggestion is that when you look at questions that involve investigations and investigative skills, you get yourself very good context of what is going on before you approach the questions. It's going to make writing down those answers or answering those questions just so much easier if you have good context. And if you don't already have them, make sure that you get your hands on the worksheet as well as the worksheet memo and the theory booklet, just to help you prepare better for your final exams. All right, Junior Techies, like I said before, I hope this has been beneficial, and I do hope to see you again in further videos.